call a faith deconstruction an entire identity makeover.
I like that. That's so true, right? That's so true.
Yeah, because your worldview helps you explain everything. So if you're changing your worldview, you're now going to have to change everything.
Welcome to Faith After Faith, a podcast that explores the territory between losing your faith and finding it again. I'm Katie Langston. When I stopped believing what I'd been raised to believe, I thought the hard part would be the beliefs. I mean, that's how it gets described mostly, right? Like a crisis of faith. Like faith is a set of propositions that you've been carrying around in a box. And one day you open the box and look at them properly and go, no. And then you set the box down and go for a walk and get on with it, you know? Maybe feeling a little lighter, maybe a little sadder, but basically the same person. Well, that is not what happened. What happened is that my entire sense of self and what I believed about the world unraveled. What I thought a body was for, what I was going to tell my kids, whether I was a good person or whether that was even a category. I did not have any language for that at the time, but Natasha Helfer does. Natasha is a licensed marriage and family therapist as well as a sex therapist, and she has spent about 30 years sitting with people in exactly this situation, mostly Mormons and post-Mormons, though the pattern is similar in other contexts. She's been through her very own public reckoning with the church she grew up in, and we'll get to that, but that's not really why I wanted to talk with her. I wanted to talk to her because she has watched this happen to hundreds of people, and she has some very helpful insights about what's going on beneath it. Just a quick content warning, we do talk frankly about sexuality in a few places. She's a sex therapist after all, so be prepared for that. As usual, with Natasha, I started at the beginning. What did her identity formation look like?
Yeah, my story starts as far as the religious intersection with my parents converting to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I will from here on out say the Mormon Church. And so I converted when I was about 5 years old. Okay. I was old enough to remember the missionaries coming to our door and some of the basic things that were happening in my family system at that time. And so, yeah, as you can imagine, that's a very formative time in a child's life, of course. And I don't really remember, other than the fact that they came to our home, I don't really remember anything prior to that as far as identity formation. I feel like my entire identity formation really went through the LDS lens and you know, for better or for worse, I guess, as far as how that plays. And I think all of us have systems that help form us and our identities, and our parents' belief systems and our community belief systems play a huge role in that. And for many of us, religion plays a huge role in that because it's so intertwined with our families and communities. So yeah, my sense of self, my sense of morality, my sense of what my purpose was in life, my sense of even the classic Mormon, you know, children's song, I am a child of God, which then, of course, as I entered the young women's programs, you know, it's now I am a daughter of God. And then, of course, I'm a woman of faith who stands for truth and righteousness, right? So all along the path of development, I was, in a sense, being told who I was and accepting that as part of my identity.
I Am a Child of God is a primary song, primary being the Mormon children's program, ages 3 to 11. And every Mormon kid can sing it from memory, and it is a genuinely lovely song. But it's also the first move in a sequence. Like first you're a child of God, then a daughter of God, then woman of faith who stands for truth and righteousness, each one a little more specific about who you're supposed to be. Growing up, you were it sounds like pretty devout. Did you ever bristle against it or, you know, have questions or rebel, or was your rebellion later?
Yeah, well, I was very devout. And of course, it's so interesting that even as you're asking me that question, I'm noticing activation, because what does it mean to be devout in Mormonism? It means to be behaviorally obedient, right, to standards. And so I don't ever remember feeling rebellious. And yet there are things that I did that did not keep the standards, right? Even certain things that I felt like I really, truly wanted to do, but just couldn't get myself to do it, like daily scripture study. Like I can't tell you how many times I started the Book of Mormon probably never completely finished it,
Yeah.
right? And I was so sad and upset with myself that I couldn't keep to these goals. And then, as I became a mental health therapist, I started having some, cognitive dissonance, I think is, what most people might call it, where not everything about how you were taught necessarily matches what you're living. And so it was interesting becoming a therapist because now it wasn't just my story or how my identity integrated with this entity called Mormonism. It was how all of my clients were showing up, right? I started realizing, yeah, even within the same group, we're all having some really different experiences. And things that I find useful or helpful to me spiritually is actually being harmful to somebody else and vice versa. And so from a pretty early age, I'm talking about like mid-20s, because I became a therapist when I was 20. I started going to school at 23, graduated from the program at 25. I was starting to grapple with, this truth, this one and only truth that my church tells me I have access to is not necessarily showing up the same for everyone.
So that's a person trying as hard as she can. But what changed wasn't her. It was the size of her sample. When she realized that she wasn't the only one struggling. It really is, from what I know of you, is more like, hey, this isn't right. This is hurting people. And it sounds like, just based on what I know of your story, that did come out of your experience with your clients to a large extent. Is that right?
Yes. I was able to get mad in behalf of my clients, just like I can get mad in behalf of my children.
Yeah.
Much easier than I can get mad in behalf of myself, which is sad. And I think a lot of us struggle with that. We're willing to put up with a lot of things, especially if you're socialized as a woman in our culture at large. We're taught to accommodate and sacrifice, and especially in religious cultures. And men are taught that too, but there's like an extra dose of it, I think, if you're socialized.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And so, yes, I started seeing things that were not, were taught in religion, or at least things that mattered to me is like by the fruits you shall know them. That was like a doctrinal thing that really made sense to me, and so if we're being told by a divine being, hey, these are some things you may want to pay attention to, then the fruits of that would let you know whether or not that's really coming from God or not.
Right.
Well, so then why am I seeing so many of the Mormon women I was working with so depressed, so stuck in perfectionism, so hard on themselves, even though these were like some of the best women, right? Like some of the best, loving, heartfelt, wanting to do what's right, and yet they can't keep up with their expectations. So that was a constant theme. Why am I seeing our queer folks dying at higher rates than anybody else, not feeling accepted, not finding affirming spaces in the most sacred spaces that should be on earth, right? Which is our churches. Why are they suffering at such high levels? Then, of course, the sexual shame, like, we put so much emphasis on purity and virginity and righteous sex that we're doing it in a way that actually like paralyzes people or makes them feel so horribly about themselves. And when I look at the language that a lot of these churches use, it's very, very provocative. The verbiage is so abusive, perverse, evil, degenerate, pernicious, like,
Right.
woof. Like, talk about identity formation, right? And especially if you're a young, prepubescent or pubescent child or an emerging adult, like those words really hit home. And probably the worst you're doing is masturbating or having some fantasy of something that you shouldn't be thinking about, because you should only be thinking about like some future spouse or something, right?
Right.
Thinking about Britney Spears. Oh no, I'm a pernicious evildoer, and so, and I started seeing that the fruits of this was mental health symptoms, self-hatred, secrecy.
Oh yeah,
That's a lot of secrecy between family members and especially spouses, because I can't really tell you what's going on for me because you might leave me or hate me or not trust me around our kids anymore, especially in the realms of sexuality. I'm seeing mixed orientation marriages. I'm seeing people like really suffering at high levels when they're trying to comply with things that are supposed to, in our language anyway, in Mormonism, this is supposed to be the plan of happiness. I wasn't seeing always that fruit of happiness be the result.
Right. Yeah, it was like more like the plan of misery and shame in some ways. Yeah. So she started writing about it publicly under her own name, about masturbation, about sexual orientation, about the porn addiction model, about what the research actually says. And the church kind of put up with her for about a decade, and then they excommunicated her. We're going to come back to that. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask her what an identity actually is.
Well, I'll share with you, I do think this is a very universal question, and I don't think I have the answer to it. But I think that when I talk to my faith transition, like support groups, I have a whole week, every day, every time we meet, we start with, okay, there's like identity, in my view, covers 5 different sections of your life. And this is just according to Natasha. This is not research-based or anything, but I start with personal identity, right? Personal identity being the classic questions that religion tries to answer. Who am I? Who am I? What does it mean to be on this rotating circle we call Earth? Why am I here?
Right.
What's the purpose of my life? Why do we suffer? Why do we have pleasure? What happens after we leave here, right? Like, is that the end, or is there something more? Is my identity tied to my body being alive, or is it something bigger than that, right? And so these are really universal questions that I think have a lot of beautiful potential answers to them. Mormonism definitely gave me some very distinct answers that I had to believe in order to consider myself a Mormon. And they do want to identify as Mormon, right? And so that's kind of how I conceptualize personal identity. Then there's relational identity, right? Because, okay, if I'm going to go through some type of belief system shift, who are the people that's going to affect the most outside of me is my closest circle, which that's probably my spouse, or depending on your age, your parent or a sibling or your best friend. And that now affects our relational identity, right? What does it mean to be attached to you or to me? How is this going to affect our dynamics? Are we going to stay married or not? Are we still compatible? Do we have to believe the same things in order to feel close to one another? So how this, and then even the identities of what does it mean to be a wife? What does it mean to be a mother? Like, religions have a lot to say about that.
They do sometimes, right?
Even what it means to be like a woman or a man, depending on the genitalia you were born with, right? And so there's a lot of that relational identity. Then I think about sexual identity, which I guess could be part of both, but this is more like, now, how do I show up as a sexual creature on this planet? And again, we've been told a lot of things about how we should show up.
Right.
But what do I really enjoy? What does my erotic template look like? Who am I attracted to? And that, boy, have we been downloaded a lot of messages about our sexual identities, right? And whether you're masculine enough, feminine enough, sexy enough, attractive enough, all those things. Then if you're a parent, there's parenting identity, right? How do you see yourself as a parent? And what are you going to now teach your children about their identity and your own identity? That's a whole nother can of worms, right? And so what is morality? What are ethics? What does it mean to be a good parent? Do we helicopter around them? Do we let them be a little bit more, like self-determining? Very difficult to know what the right parenting approach is. And then the last one is a community identity, because it's not just your closest relationships. It's like when you walk into a Mormon church and you say you are Mormon, or you walk into Disneyland and you see the person with the BYU shirt on and you've got a BYU shirt on too. There is community identity in that. We don't even have to talk. We can just look at each other, smile, and know that we are part of something bigger than ourselves because we're part of that same group, right?
Yep.
And we do this with sports teams. We do this with politics. We do this with, all kinds of things. And I see it also too in the ex-Mormon world, right?
Yes.
Like, soon as you meet somebody who's been through a deconstruction process, like you have been, you immediately have a lot in common that you assume that helps you bond with that person. So that's kind of community identity. So those are the 5 like buckets that
Ooh, I like that.
come up with to try to help people think, oh, these are all the different parts of identity that now I'm going to have to look at as I'm going through a faith deconstruction. I call a faith deconstruction an entire identity makeover.
I like that. That's so true, right? That's so true.
Yeah. Because your worldview helps you explain everything.
Exactly.
So if you're changing your worldview, you're now going to have to change everything.
How you think of yourself, how you think of other people. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that kind of strikes me is like, especially if you've been handed an identity, right? Sometimes it's almost invisible. And the process of deconstruction or a faith crisis or whatever you want to call it suddenly makes visible things that were not visible before in terms of the assumptions that you have about, life, the universe, and everything. And from the outside, a person who is seeing their quote unquote programming for the first time does not look like they're getting healthier. They look like they're coming apart. And to be clear, all of us have programming, whether or not we come from a religious background, and self-awareness and mental and emotional well-being will inevitably involve some painful examination. But what's really going on when we do this? And so when folks are kind of going through that, what sorts of ways do you see them handling things maybe in ways that are on the more healthy side versus the less healthy side?
Right. Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard not to, because I see what you're saying with healthy versus unhealthy while we're also trying to make room for messiness. Right. And I think that there's a lot of actual health in having it be a messy process.
Yeah.
Very healthy when you're
right.
Like stuck in a muddy space, where you're really struggling. But I'd say that, a lot of the things that we come from continue to be things where we're going. So you tend to be a black and white thinker over here. You're more than likely going to be a black and white thinker over here, just about different topics or on a different, like if you were a missionary wanting to evangelize, your message as a Mormon missionary, it's very common to then want to evangelize as a Mormon, post-Mormon, right?
Yeah.
And or sharing, like your new truths, but you're doing the same thing, just with different information.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very human thing. That doesn't mean that we're bad or that we're doing it wrong. That's just a very normal, but I think the more we're self-aware of that, then we can kind of maybe interrupt some of those patterns. Because I don't want, at least for me, my goal is not to deconstruct so I can reconstruct something just as harmful, just with different belief systems.
Right.
I want to really reconstruct something very different than the system I came from. And that's just challenging. It's challenging as a human to do that.
Yeah.
So I think I see a lot of pendulum swings. I see a lot of like, well, I wasn't allowed to do this, so now I'm going to totally do this thing over here. And I again, why I don't see that as a mistake is because I think that's developmentally appropriate. We have to do some of that pendulum swinging and messiness in order to eventually land where we might feel most comfortable. And if you're looking at identity development, what a lot of these high demand churches do, as well as high demand parenting systems, is they really try to interrupt that developmental, those tasks that we're supposed to be doing from the ages of like 15 to 25. That's a developmentally appropriate time to think our parents are full of it, to think that we know better than everybody else, to rebel, to test the limits, to figure out what do I really think, especially as I plan to fly the coop from my parents and do it on my own. But in high demand systems, we discourage that exploration. We call it the slippery slope. We call it, being sinful. We call it being rebellious.
Right.
We call it being promiscuous if you're doing anything sexual. And we want to keep you in this safe container, what the older folks think is a safe container, so that we get you through that dangerous developmental time where you might actually go off what we think is the the rails and keep you in the group. And so we interrupt that normal identity development because we're so scared of you coming up with different ideas about life and different behaviors that we're not comfortable with and different identity formation than what we want. We want to project our identities really on our children. That's what churches are doing. That's what parents are doing on a regular basis. So as people leave, I mean, a lot of people leave high demand religion. And again, I'll choose Mormon examples because that's what I'm most familiar with. But people will start drinking coffee or alcohol, which are forbidden,
Sinners.
you know, Mormonism, right? Or they'll start dressing differently or getting tattoos because those are not, you know, they're frowned upon. And so all of that can feel like a reaction to the leaving. And sometimes people downplay that, like, that's just silly, or you're going through a phase, or that's just dumb. And I'm like, well, you are going through a really pretty important phase.
Right.
Revisiting a developmental stage that you were not allowed to explore. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Erickson, right? Who kind of came up with, as far as I know, there's a lot of indigenous people that came up with a lot of stuff before we called it certain things.
Right.
In white psychology America. But anyway, this idea that developmental theory is like, if you don't go through those tasks when you were supposed to, you will be limited, and you'll probably have to revisit those tasks before you can move forward in any significant way.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us are doing that in our 30s, 40s, 50s.
Right.
You know, and then you hit, of course, 40s and 50s land, which that's a whole nother developmental journey of also exploring, right? Because this is usually when your kids are a little bit more, you know, for most people older, can take care of themselves. You're hitting midlife. You're starting to realize I only have so much time left. There's a lot of developmental tasks in your midlife that's about revisiting whether or not what you've been doing is really going to serve you forever. So if you mix that with a faith transition, now you've got a double whammy, because not only do you have to go back and do teenager work, but you're also doing midlife work, and that can feel very difficult for folks. And for people who are observing it, it can feel destructive.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I had not thought of it in terms of like those in terms of the developmental stages. What is it like? Would you say that some of these cultures, you know, let's say, again, we could talk about Mormon culture because that's the one that we're the most familiar with, but like Mormon culture is like, it's like designed to keep people, like, does the culture itself have like a default developmental stage? Is that a thing?
Yeah, and that's an interesting way to put it. I know Fowler has come up with like different developmental stages of religion,
faith,
right?
Or faith communities or whatever.
Yeah, and it's kind of a developmental model, you know, and I think that if I had to put the Mormon church in a developmental model, I would say it's in its 30s. It's early to mid 30s, because that's when we nest. That's when we have littles that we're trying to protect. That's when we're most, like, in our parenting style, most authoritarian, like, don't touch the red stove.
Right.
Don't cross the street without holding my hand.
Right. Yeah.
So it is kind of, and it's not old enough yet to have done its own deconstruction, right? So I guess that's kind of how I would.
Well, that's interesting. We're still the little kids. We don't get to if the church is in its 30s, then we're the little kids who don't get to go through the, like you were saying, the sort of teenage individuation or teenage emerging adult, young adult kind of sense of exploration and saying, coming into your own sense of self. I mean, I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but
yeah, no. And I think the Mormon church definitely acts like a parent. It does not welcome you into equality of ideas or thoughts, although it has this doctrine that we are all going to eventually be peers with God, which is what makes a lot of Christian denominations angry with us. We don't practice it at all in this world. And I see that in how we treat, I'll never forget my one client, which I'll talk about because I believe she's probably passed, but she was in her 70s. And this was 30 years ago that I met with her very early, one of my first clients. And she was telling me that her husband had died. So she was a widow. She was probably about 75 years old. And she felt so guilty that she was masturbating to her husband's memory that she went in and talked to her bishop about this, and he took her temple recommend away. So we are treating this 75-year-old woman like she's a 13-year-old naughty girl who shouldn't be touching her own privates, right? With no context of, first of all, trauma, grief, because of course we don't train anybody to be trauma informed in our church. Some churches do much better work at that than the Mormon church does. And yeah, she's in trouble. She's in trouble. She's a naughty girl, and the bishop is like the daddy figure, right?
Yuck. Yeah.
And this is how we function in Mormonism.
Yuck. Yeah. That's a really sad story. I hate that story.
Yeah. And it's one of 5 bajillion stories, right? That I've got.
Yeah. So for you, then that led to you kind of starting to speak up publicly, not just in your therapeutic relationships, but also, I mean, I remember finding your blog way back in the Mormon, in the Mormon bloggernacle days and being relieved actually, because I was, some of the things you were saying were so helpful and so normal and sort of normalized experiences I had had or questions that I had. But then that eventually kind of got you into trouble, right? With the trouble with the church.
Right. Isn't there a saying that if we will be getting into some good trouble?
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Yes. Yeah, I started a blog kind of back in the day when that was just starting. I was a little bit bored, and I thought, oh, well, I like to write. And I thought of this idea of kind of like a Dear Abby, but for therapists. I'll just for people who are Mormon and they want to ask a therapist a question, I'll put myself out there. And I thought, I don't know, I'm going to get questions about depression. I'm going to get questions about parenting. I'm going to get questions about basic marriage dynamics. So that's kind of what I was expecting. And pretty much right away, it was sex.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I guess I should have thought about that. If people can ask anonymous questions.
Right. That's what's keeping them up at night. Yeah.
Exactly. So that actually started me being interested in getting more training. That's when I really started getting more training to become a sex therapist. I didn't start with the idea of being a thorn in anybody's side, but all of a sudden, all these sexual things started coming up. I needed to find this balance between being able to share clinically sound information while also trying to, make room for our belief system and our values as Mormon folks. And that became really difficult, and especially with time, more difficult, especially I think what really threw me over the top, the first time I really wrote something that I was like, this might get me into some good trouble, is when I wrote a blog. I think the name of it was Masturbation is Not a Sin. And what led me to click publish on a publication that I knew I was going to write something that opposed the church's stance was the deep harm that I was seeing this teaching have, especially on our teens. So I think just that last month before I wrote that piece, I don't know, there's maybe like 3 or 4 teens I had seen, which, our LDS
so
teens
normal.
like
Kids, you're just
teens.
normal.
They're like the
I
best
know.
kids. And they're doing all the things, right? They're doing extra things. They're going to seminary. They're getting good grades in high school. They're having callings at church. They're going to all the church activities, and they're trying to serve other people, and they're trying to get scholars. I mean, we've got high functioning LDS teens, and instead of them feeling confident and good, because especially of masturbation, they're self-harming, they're depressed, they see themselves as really bad kids. Yeah, there's some horrific sexual sins that, if we want to call them sins or whatever you want to call them, that really, really damage people's lives. But these kids are touching their own bodies, exploring their own curiosities, feeling like they're addicts because, of course, a sexual drive is repetitive, and because they can't stop this normal, natural drive, they see it as something now that's an addiction, because that's the type of language we are using oftentimes in these high demand religions. And after having so many of these teens, like either self-harming or suicidal, I'm like, I can't just help. I can't just help anymore in the trenches. Like, okay, you go harm these teens and then I'll come help them.
Right.
I'm like, we have got to stop harming these teens to begin with.
Right.
I've got to get through to like, because this is just I mean,
Right.
sure, I can make money off this the rest of my life. I can continue to be, harmed by masturbation ideas, but it's not fair to them. And it's just a horrific thing for me and my colleagues to have to sit with this consistent self-loathing.
Yeah. So did that, I remember that post. Did it get you into trouble? Or, I mean, I remember it was up for a long time and kind of there was nothing.
Still up.
Yeah. Well, of course, right.
somewhere in the
in the great white cloud.
So the one thing that happened after I wrote that blog, without anybody talking to me, without anybody calling me in or saying anything to me, now I had clients coming to see me and going, I don't know why, but the bishop said they can no longer like support me seeing you, financially, because sometimes the church
will help pay
afford, for therapy costs or things like that. And so I was like, oh, okay. So, and then I had my current bishop at the time, I believe, kind of let me know, like he was tattling on the system. He was like, just so you know, in all these meetings, you're coming up as somebody not to refer to. And so, but nobody had talked to me. I've never had any issue with my license, but they were not willing to refer to me.
Yikes. Not good.
That shows, right? Like we've got some problems. We've got some problems with that intersection of mental health training and religious belief system of the therapists themselves.
Right.
How that shows up clinically for people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then eventually you were excommunicated, right? For kind of refusing to say, hey, no, I'm going to go along with this, with the research. I'm going to be a research-based, evidence-based therapist. Yeah.
I think it took about a little less than a decade, which I give the church kudos for putting up with me for a decade. Put up with each other for a decade.
Right.
At least we were able to have some flexibility. But yes, I just kept on writing. I didn't stop at masturbation. I started writing, of course, a lot about gay rights. I wrote a lot about the porn addiction model not being an effective model. Yeah. So yes, I was starting to become, in those particular topics, very misaligned from the church leadership.
What did that do to your sense of identity, and how did you feel your own identity shifting during that, let's say, decade-long mutual toleration less and less between you and the church?
Yeah, I think I have 3 different identity shifts. I mean, one I think was just the small little bits of my belief system shifting as I was working with people and when my kids were growing up, and I was shifting some of my ideas. So that, I started to identify definitely as progressive, as a Mormon, progressive Mormon, out of the box thinker. I was definitely starting to let go of more what I would call literal beliefs and seeing things more from like an abstract or a symbolic way, instead of like, I don't know, like the flood really happened. It was like, okay, the story that has meaning, and what meaning do you want to get out of it, whether or not it historically accurately happened the way it says.
Which it did
in the book. Right, exactly. And so then I started being very comfortable in that identity, that I still love my Mormon community. I still want to be here. I think I have something to offer. Other people have things to offer me. And even though it's not as literal as I once thought, because Mormonism is very literal.
Super
it's very
literal.
Historical, in the sense like we believe, if you don't believe these historical things happen, then kind of the thing falls apart. And so a lot of that was falling apart for me, but I was still able to ground it in this idea that religion is a meaning-making machine, and there's a lot of beauty here that I can still, enjoy. So then I went through the excommunication process, and that was very shocking to me, how my nervous system responded.
Wow.
Because I thought I was prepared. I thought I was prepared back when 10 years, before when I that masturbation post. I thought,
I might get, in big trouble for this.
In big trouble for this,
Yeah.
right? And I thought, well, I'm still willing to take the stance. And so then, but when it really happened, I was like, oh, man, this identity runs deep. It runs to feel rejected in my identity, to be able to be told you can no longer identify as a member of this church, and all the things that I no longer held, again, literal value to, but I realized how much emotional value I still have. And even though I didn't really believe that these, however many men, 3 or 6 or 12 or however many made this decision around me, I didn't really believe that they had the power to take anything from me. It still felt like they did.
So here we are back at Natasha's excommunication, and it's important to note that by the time it happened, she had deconstructed her faith significantly. She was a symbolic rather than literal Mormon and had been for years. She'd done a lot of intellectual work and therapeutic work, and she was, by her own account, prepared. You see, the thing is, even though Natasha was intellectually prepared for her excommunication, it wasn't until it happened that she realized how deep her Mormon identity really was. And I think that's because for all of our Western idealism about choosing our own path and becoming our authentic selves, the reality is that none of us escapes this life without some pre-programming. The question is, what do we do once we realize it?
And so that really hit my identity in a really interesting way, that I was like, wow, I'm tied to this a lot more than I realized. And I've really formulated so much of my life around this identity. And then the third wave, which is where I'm at now, is just consistently going, wow, who knows?
I love it. Right.
The hell my identity is going to do on a given day. There's still moments of deconstruction. There's a lot of beautiful reconstruction. There's insights that I get, different, things I bring in from lots of different traditions. And it feels like an evolving, ongoing process, which I actually am really enjoying, although sometimes it can be a little anxiety producing. I'm really happy where I'm at right now with my identity.
So when someone is in the thick of that, talk to me a little bit about the ways in which reconstructing a worldview and reconstructing an identity kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. Right. Well, your worldview basically, I think, is the umbrella that your identity falls under, right? As well as other things. But so really, when you're trying to reconstruct, it's like, well, what is the role of me? What difference do I make? And not just me, but how also do relationships matter, right? Because we tend to be, at least here in the United States of America, very individualistic in our values system. But you go to other places of the world like China and India and even parts of Africa, it's parts of Latin America that are very communal.
Right.
And a lot of our worldview is more about how you function within a community, which can also be seen as high demand cultures.
Sure.
And yet it doesn't necessarily mean that when those people immigrate to our country and become more Americanized, that they do better. So there's this big kind of tension between individualistic and communal cultures, and both have pros and cons to them. We can't say we, the Americans, we won. We have the healthiest individual system, right?
Just look around you. That's not the case.
Right. So I think that there is this constant tension that all humans are in, is that we are pack animals and we are individuals. And that tension is constant. I know it's very classic for post-Mormons or post-Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever to tell me, I wish I would have never been Mormon, right? I wish I would have been able to be raised in a home where I wouldn't have gotten these downloads. I'm like, well, you would have gotten downloads.
You would have gotten some other downloads, right?
Would have gotten down. There's no download-free human experience.
Now, as I've been thinking about this, a word that keeps coming back for me is integration. Integration. Somehow I think healing means integrating the parts of ourselves and our experiences and all of our history into our sense of self. It means making peace with what happened to us, not excusing it, but acknowledging that it happened and somehow finding a way to be okay. And that just takes time.
So I think I don't have a great answer to your question, because I think it really is very personal. And I think that where we can find anywhere, my favorite two words are probably flexibility and balance, right? So if I'm too rigid, that's when things break. If I'm too loosey-goosey, then there's nothing to stand on, right? So there's got to be some type of like balance between rigidity and chaos.
And maybe, to a certain extent, that is the work, right? That is the work, is finding that balance between your worldview and your sense of identity and the way you relate to the people around you and to the world, right? And I think to a certain extent, you can only live into it.
Yeah.
You know what I
Right.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot, I know for me, like when I was going through it, there was a lot of like, well, just tell me what the right way is to go. Just tell me what, if they told me this was what I needed to be before and that didn't work out very well. And so now just tell me what the thing is now that I need to be. And actually the real thing is beginning to feel it in your body.
Yeah.
Like this.
To embody it.
Yeah.
Yes. And to see it ongoing work. It's never ending.
I like to tell people is just always throughout all of this, your fundamental belovedness is never at stake, ever. That's just never, ever, ever at stake. There could be a lot of things at stake, but like you're being beloved, you're being accepted, right? And I would say, as a pastor, I would say like by God or like the divine or whatever you want to say, but you're always accepted and you're always beloved. And so if you can start from that framework of that kind of sense of confidence, or if you can find that kind of sense of confidence, then a lot of this work, I'm not going to say it becomes easier, but it becomes a lot less fraught in a way.
Yeah. 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 I think that's exactly correct. It's kind of that idea of inherent worth and in some ways self-love, while at the same time, you don't ever get to self-love on your own, right? It requires a parent or a pastor or other people because we just don't get to a space of really esteeming ourselves by ourselves. That's what I mean by the fact that we're pack animals, right?
Like
we rely on others. And in pop psychology, we often talk about, well, you have to love yourself first. I'm like, well, what island do we all go on to? Love ourselves by ourselves.
Right. What island do we all go on? The truth is, we need each other with all our flawed, messy, bewildering complications. Boy, that's good, man. That'll preach. I'm going to use that in a sermon sometime. because like, again, from a Lutheran standpoint, so now I'm going to theologize you just for a second, Natasha.
I love it.
But from a Lutheran standpoint, we talk about how the word of acceptance, the word of grace, the word of love comes to us from another source, right? It comes to us from God. It comes to us from our community, where we're reminded again and again that we're loved, that we're accepted, that we're okay, because we do need that. We do need that. We need to hear it from other people as much as we need to tell it ourselves, I think.
It can feel so isolating to go through a worldview shift. And so you have to risk finding people who have similar doubts, similar questions, and who've maybe walked the path that you're about to walk, so that you don't have to feel so isolated. And isolation, we don't do well with that as humans. And the research shows it doesn't take that many people. We're talking about like 1 to 3 people.
Right.
1 to 3 people can make a huge difference.
Thank you so much. Always the last question we ask of our guests: what does faith after faith look like for you?
I love that question. Well, it's so interesting, right? How the word faith has been really almost like, if you say the word faith, immediately people think religion, right? Those two words are like super tied. And so for me, it's faith, really getting to the heart of what it means. And it's being able to believe in things that we don't necessarily have a lot of evidence for. And what I really like about that definition, although I do think I do have evidence, but I have to continually test it, is the connection of humanity. I think I really do have faith and some evidence to point to that when we are connected to each other, when we can really consider the entire human family, we do better. We do better spiritually. We do better in our health and our immune systems and our ability to relate. We have more pleasure and joy. We have more compassion and empathy. When I think about the best teachings, even in religious practices, like even in doctrines, it's like we are all children of God, right? And so even, I I would consider myself an agnostic right now. I'm
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, I could be God, could be not. But even if you use that language, we're missing the real gospel messages that have to do with human unity and how desperate we need each other. And yet we kill each other and we abuse each other and we other each other and we tell each other awful things. And I think for me, faith is trying to have faith that we can overcome the horrible ways we are to each other, because at the end of the day, we need each other so much.
Yeah. Wow. That's beautiful and super deep. So
It's my faith after faith.
I love it. Thank you so much, Natasha Helfer. Thanks for being with us today on Faith After Faith.
Katie Langston, I appreciate the invite, and I think you're doing amazing work as well.
And if you're in the middle of your own identity makeover right now, remember, 1 to 3 people. That's all you need. Natasha Helfer is a therapist, a sex therapist, a podcast, and soon-to-be-published author. You can find more of her work at natashahelfer.com. And if you want access to our full unedited conversation, including parts where she shares more about her story and her work in bringing research-based therapy to Mormon culture, you can find that at katielangston.com/podcast, where for whatever amount you feel moved to, you can donate to this program to help make it possible and receive access to unedited conversations and bonuses. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app, or like and subscribe on YouTube. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay is to share this podcast with a friend. I'm Katie Langston. Thanks for being here on Faith After Faith.